Hereditário. Chapter 1. The Loss. Ellen Graham's funeral was a dark and silent event. The chapel, wrapped in shadows, was filled with the restless whisper of those present. Annie, her daughter, watched the closed coffin, still absorbing the reality of the loss. There was something peculiar about the mother's death, not ordinary mourning, but an oppressive weight that hovered over all. She had a lot of secrets, Annie told her husband, Steve, when they returned home. Always reserved, but lately, I felt she was different. Steve, practical as always, did not make much case of Annie's feelings. Death brings this. Confusing memories. Let time do his job. Charlie, the youngest daughter, was quiet. Since she was a child, she had a strange connection with her grandmother. Now she spent her days alone, drawing disturbing figures on her notebook, as if talking to something invisible. She is fine? Steve asked Annie one night as they watched Charlie in a corner. She is dealing with her way, Annie replied, but her eyes showed concern. That same night, while everyone slept, Annie was awakened by a soft noise from the bottom floor. A weak light leaked from the living room. Slowly down the stairs, her heart accelerated with each step. Upon entering the room, he found something that paralyzed her. Ellen's photo, the deceased grandmother, was covered with candles around, like a makeshift altar. The flames fluttered, throwing shadows that seemed to move on their own will. Charlie, Annie whispered to herself, with a cold in her spine. But when he looked around, the house was silent. What is really happening to this family? Something is just starting to emerge from the shadows. Chapter 2. The Notebook. The days became stranger after the episode of the altar. Annie tried to ignore, putting everything in the morning account. However, in the house of the Graham, the weight of silence was unbearable. Charlie, with her strange creations, seemed increasingly distant. One morning, as he passed Charlie's room, Annie noticed the open notebook at the table. The pages were filled with grotesque designs, portraying figures with deformed heads, party bodies, and symbols that Annie could not decipher. She felt a shiver. It was not Charlie's art style. These images had something sinister, something that seemed ritualistic. Charlie, what is this? Annie asked later, trying not to sound alarmed. I don't know, just draw what I see, Charlie replied with the same calm voice as usual, without lifting her eyes as her notebook. Meanwhile, Peter, the older brother, tried to deal with his own discomfort. He felt something strange at home, something he couldn't name. Sounds in the middle of the night, shadows that looked more dense than usual. He started to have nightmares, waking up sweaty and panting. In his dreams, he saw his grandmother, Ellen, stopped in the corner of the room, watching him, always silent. One night, while Steve worked late and the children slept, Annie decided to search her mother's belongings in the attic. An old box caught his attention. Upon opening, he found ancient books, all related to occultism, rituals, and invocations. Your heart began to beat faster. Among the books, a photo of Ellen with a group of strangers. There was something familiar in the image, a symbol, the same as Charlie had repeatedly drawn in the notebook. Suddenly a cold wind blown around the room, making the book's pages open alone. Annie held the book tightly, trying to close, but her eyes stopped in a phrase that seemed to shine in the darkness. The lineage never ends. The sacrifice is inevitable. Chapter 3. The Ritual. Annie descended from the attic with her heart fired, her hands shaking. She tried to see what she had just read. That phrase about sacrifice, symbolism, Ellen's photos, everything seemed to point to something she refused to believe. However, the discomfort grew inside it, like a dark presence that stared at every corner of the house. That night, Graham's house was wrapped in a deeper than normal silence. Peter, as usual, had another disturbing nightmare. This time he saw Charlie surrounded by hooded figures, muttering words in a language he did not recognize. When I wake up, sweating cold, he looked at the clock, 3:15 in the morning. That time was repeated every night. Rising to take a glass of water, Peter heard a strange sound from Charlie's room. He hesitated before going there, feeling that something was not right. As he slowly opened the door, he found his sister sitting on the bed, drawing frantically with his eyes glazed. Charlie? He called, but she didn't answer. Approaching, he looked at her notebook and saw the drawing of a circle, surrounded by incomprehensible symbols. In the center of the circle, a figure with horns. A chill ran through Peter's spine. "This is not normal," he whispered, slowly retreating. As soon as he turned to leave, he heard a soft, deep voice. "You can't escape." Peter froze. The heart hammered in the chest. He looked around, but the room was empty except Charlie, who was still drawing, oblivious to what was happening around him. Trembling, he ran out of the room and returned to his bed, covering his head, but knowing that the terror would not disappear so easily. The next morning, during breakfast, Annie watched her children, noticing the tiredness evident on their faces. The discomfort in the air was palpable. Steve, always trying to maintain normality, tried to break the silence with small conversation, but all seemed distant. "I think there is something very wrong here," Peter finally said, looking straight at his mother. "Charlie, the nightmares, there is something in the house." Annie hesitated. She also felt that, but how to admit that something supernatural was at stake? She herself still didn't want to believe it. "We are all dealing with the loss in different ways," she said, trying to sound firmly, though her voice shook lightly. But the feeling that something was deeply wrong didn't disappear. Chapter 4. The Return. Over the days, the signs that something supernatural haunted the Graham family became impossible to ignore. Annie took themselves looking at Ellen's makeshift altar more and more, the candles lit on their own, as if an invisible force was manipulating the objects around him. One afternoon, determined to understand more about her mother's hidden truth, Annie returned to the attic. This time his mind was more open to what he would find there. Ellen's books, full of old symbols and enchantments, now seemed to have a clear purpose. She began to flip into one of them, focusing on a section on spiritual heredity. The words of the text were frighteningly accurate, describing how certain strains were intended to be involved in dark rituals that went from generation to generation. The only way to interrupt the cycle, according to the book, was through a final sacrifice. Suddenly a strong noise made her startle. It was Peter, stopped at the attic door. "Mom, you feel, don't you?" Annie looked at her son, wide eyes, unable to deny. "I feel, Peter. And I think it's linked to her grandmother. She was involved in something much bigger than we imagined." The two went down to the living room, sitting at the kitchen table. Peter began to talk about the nightmares, voices, and shadows he saw at night. "I can't ignore that anymore. It seems that Grandma never left." It was then that the kitchen door opened with a soft creak. In the hallway, Charlie appeared, holding her notebook, but something was different from her. Her eyes, once calm and distant, now shone with a frightening intensity. "It's time, Mom," she said, her voice sounding older than her age allowed. Annie looked at Steve, who had just entered, confused and scared. "At the time of what, Charlie?" "When it comes to finishing what Grandma started." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of a door knocking somewhere in the house, echoing like a omen. Chapter 5. The Revelation. Silence after Charlie's words was suffocating. Annie felt her heart shoot as she looked at her daughter, trying to decipher what meant ending what Grandma began. Steve, still confused, tried to soften the situation. "Charlie, you must be tired. Why aren't you going to lie down?" But Charlie remained standing, her fixed gaze on her mother. "She told me that I'm the chosen one. The lineage can't be broken, Mom. It's in the blood." These words made Annie freeze. The inheritance, the rituals, the inevitable sacrifice, it all began to align in your mind, like the pieces of a macabre puzzle. She knew she needed to act fast before something worse happened. Annie took Charlie by the hand, feeling the unusual warmth emanating from her daughter's skin. "Come with me," she said softly, trying to keep calm. They climbed together to Charlie's room, where Annie closed the door behind him. "What are you talking about, Charlie? What did Grandma tell you?" Charlie, with the notebook still in her hands, began to draw again. This time, the figures on paper were family members, all surrounded by the same symbol. "She told me that we can only stay together again if the sacrifice is made. One of us needs to be chosen." Annie felt the floor disappear under her feet. "Sacrifice? No, Charlie, this is absurd. Let's not do any of this." But Charlie continued to draw, impeding. "You can't stop that, Mom. It's in the blood. The chosen one has already been decided." Before Annie could question her more, Peter appeared at the door, panting. "Mom, something is wrong. The house? I saw the grandma." His words echoed through the room, but Annie had no time to react. The lights began to flash, the temperature of the house plummeted, and a mold smell filled the air. Something invisible was present, a force beyond human understanding. Suddenly the doors and windows began to hit alone. Peter looked at his mother, with panic growing up in his eyes. "We need to get out of here now." But before they could move, a powerful force threw Annie and Peter against the wall, holding them. Charlie stayed in the center of the room, smiling disturbingly, as if she knew what would come next. "It's time," she repeated, while the room around them seemed to shrink, as if her own home was alive, consuming everything around her. Chapter 6. The Chosen One. The invisible force that dominated the room made everything look out of control. Annie and Peter were arrested, unable to move, while Charlie, in the center of everything, watched with a smile that didn't seem to belong to a child. Suddenly the lights went out completely, plunging the house into a total darkness. All Annie could hear was Peter's rapid breathing beside her and the soft click of Charlie's fingers, a sound that now seemed to have a hypnotic power. When the lights came back, Annie felt her body relax, as if the force that the prey had released. But something was different. The room was taken by hooded figures, the same ones that Peter saw in his nightmares. They surrounded Charlie, their murmurs filling the air with a sinister melody. In the center of the circle formed by the figures, Annie saw the symbol that Charlie repeatedly drawn, now recorded on the wooden floor. In the heart of the symbol, an invisible presence seemed to take shape, something old and powerful. Steve, who had risen the stairs, entered the room, panting. What is this?" But before he could finish the sentence, one of the hooded figures turned to him, revealing the face of Ellen, the family matriarch. "The chosen one was found," she said, her voice coming out in a ghostly whisper. Annie began to scream, trying to fight the figures, but it was as if her body was being controlled by something beyond her will. She couldn't move, just watching while the sinister ritual continued. Charlie, now with her eyes shining in a golden tone, looked at each family member. "One of you needs to leave," she said softly, without emotion. "For the legacy to continue." Steve advanced, trying to protect his children. "This is crazy. Stop it." But it was too late. The hooded figures began to recite old words, their voices intertwined in a song that made the air vibrate. Charlie raised her hands, as if commanding the ritual, and the floor under Peter's feet began to crack. Annie shouted her son's name, but the sound was drowned out by the growing song. The house was shaking, as if they were about to crumble. And then, in a frozen time in time, Peter was wrapped in the darkness emanating from the symbol on the floor. The silence settled abruptly. The hooded figures disappeared, as was the evil presence that hovered over the house. The room returned to normal, but Peter was no longer there. Only the symbol recorded in Chow was left, burned on the wooden boards. Charlie, still standing in the center of the room, looked at her mother and father, now shrunken in terror. "He was chosen," she said calmly. "Now the legacy can continue." Annie fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. The horror of what had happened was too much to endure. Steve hugged her, but both knew that her family's fate was sealed. The ritual had been completed. And in the end, the sacrifice was made. The end. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel, like and comment on the story.